This video is about substance use disorder or addiction in layman's term. Here I will discuss the key features of addiction, the extent of the problem, and to better understand what happens in addiction, I will discuss the physiology of the addiction cycle. First, what is a substance? It's anything that a person takes in that has a potential for addiction. It can include caffeine from an innocent-looking cup of coffee, to legal substances such as tobacco, alcohol, and prescribed medications, to illegal drugs such as cocaine and methamphetamine. But addiction is not limited to substances. It may include behavioral addictions such as gambling, internet gaming, social media, sex, or shopping. Among these, only gambling disorder is included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual published by the American Psychiatric Association. Internet gaming disorder is still under consideration. On the other hand, the WHO has identified disorders in both gambling and internet gaming. Although these are behaviors and not substances, the key features of these disorders are similar to those of substance use disorders. What are these key features? The DSM-5-TR contains 12. I have grouped these 12 features into 5, a little bit different than how they are grouped in the DSM-5-TR. They are the 3 C's, which are control, consequences, and choice, plus tolerance and withdrawal. What are the features under control? First, the person consumes more than what was intended. For instance, he originally intended to drink only a bottle of beer but ends up drinking 12. Next, his life centers on the substance. He spends so much time trying to obtain the substance, taking it, or recovering from the effects of the substance. The third control criterion is craving, which is a very strong and in many instances irresistible urge to take the substance. Finally, the person may have tried giving up the substance, but their attempt is unsuccessful. The second C stands for consequence. As a result of the substance use, the person fails to fulfill major obligations, such as their obligations to family or work. They gave up social, occupational, and recreational activities because most of their time, energy, and resources are spent in substance-related activities. The use of the substance may also be linked to a physically hazardous situation. For example, they access their drug dealer in a high crime rate area or when there is frequent crackdown by the police on drug dealing situations. The third C stands for choice. The person decides on whether or not to take the drug based on the actual or potential consequences. Despite the social impairment that arises from substance use, the person still chooses to take the substance. The person may also know that they have physical or psychological problems related to substance use, but they still choose to take the substance. Example, a client with liver cirrhosis who continues alcohol intake. Tolerance is the need to progressively increase the amount of substance to achieve the desired effect. For example, initially, a bottle of beer may have been enough to produce a relaxing effect. Later, the person may need 3 bottles, then 5 bottles, then 10 bottles, and so on. In withdrawal, stopping the intake of the substance produces unpleasant and even harmful effects. These effects may range from simply annoying to life-threatening. How extensive is the problem of drug use? Take note, this does not include caffeine and nicotine, it just focuses on drugs. First, the number of drug users. That's 270 million people or 5.5% of the world population who used psychoactive drugs in the previous year. Next, the morbidity rate. About 35 million people have drug use disorders. Next, the mortality rate. How many people died? That's 0.5 million deaths annually are attributable to drug use. And the global burden of disease. More than 47 million years of healthy life loss or disability-adjusted life years were attributable to drug use in 2017. That's 47 million years of healthy life loss due to premature death or due to disability linked to drug use. In addition, it is estimated that 11 million people inject drugs. Among these 11 million people, 1.4 million live with HIV and 5.6 million live with hepatitis C. We have seen the harm that arises from addiction. But what is it really? Is addiction a moral failure or a weakness of character? No, it is not. If addiction is not a moral failure or a character weakness, then is addiction an illness? Yes, It is a physical disease that alters the way the brain works. What are these brain changes that lead to addiction? To understand how addiction develops and persists, let us see the addiction cycle. This consists of three stages: the binge or intoxication stage, the withdrawal or negative affect stage, and the preoccupation or anticipation stage. Let us see the binge or intoxication stage, wherein there are changes in the brain when a person takes a substance. So what happens when one takes a substance? It causes change in the dopamine signaling in the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. Dopamine ensures a reward system that motivates us to repeat a behavior. This is necessary for our survival. For example, eating causes our brain to release a burst of dopamine. As a neurotransmitter, that serves as a reward because it causes us to experience pleasure. And this now motivates us to repeat the behavior of eating. But in substance use disorder, a substance causes the release of 10 times the amount of dopamine compared to other pleasurable activities such as eating. In other words, the person does not just experience a burst but an explosion of dopamine. This makes taking a substance an intensely pleasurable experience, and as expected, the motivation to repeat substance use is also correspondingly intense. Aside from the explosion of dopamine, substances may also cause more opioids, such as endorphins and enkephalins and dynorphins, to be released from the brain. Opioids are another group of substances that makes a person feel good. So that is another motivator to continue taking in the substance. Substances also stimulate the area in the brain that is involved in habit formation. So in the future, the taking in of substances will not require too much conscious decision making. Instead, it becomes an almost automatic action when stimulated by the right environmental cues. It's just like brushing your teeth. It's your habit to brush your teeth after every meal. Then the action becomes almost automatic, no need to think about it. Similarly, when a person sees a bottle of beer or he walks near a bar or he sees others drinking, taking in alcohol becomes an almost automatic response. Now let's see what happens in the withdrawal or negative affect stage. What happens when the person stops taking the substance? First, the level of dopamine drops. Remember that it was the explosion of dopamine that caused the intensely pleasurable feeling associated with drug use. Now, the drop in dopamine level causes the loss of that pleasurable feeling. Aside from the drop in dopamine, there's a second process that occurs in the withdrawal stage. This is the activation of stress neurotransmitters. Included here are norepinephrine and corticotropin releasing factor. This stimulates the secretion of cortisol, a substance associated with stress, so the person experiences negative emotional states such as anxiety. Because of the loss of pleasure and the negative emotional states associated with abstinence, the person begins to seek the substance again. This is the preoccupation or anticipation states in the addiction cycle. What causes the person to seek the substance? It is because the brain releases glutamate. This is an excitatory neurotransmitter. This creates a powerful urge to use the substance in the presence of substance-associated cues, such as, for example, empty liquor bottles, cigarette butts, drug paraphernalia. The sight of all of these can cause the craving to intensify. Remember the habit response system in the brain that makes wanting to take the drug an almost automatic response? This system contributes to drug seeking. The person becomes preoccupied with the craving for the substance. But there is also conscious decision making here because it also involves the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is responsible for making decisions and executing these decisions. It is the part that will enable the person to give in to the impulse or to override the impulse, whichever he would choose. If the individual chooses to give in to the impulse, then this is the part of the brain that will determine his plan on how he will obtain the drug. The three stages of the addiction cycle feed into each other. The person takes the substance and experiences a reward. That's the pleasure that is experienced. The effect of the substance wears off and the person experiences withdrawal that makes them preoccupied with obtaining and taking the substance again. So it becomes a vicious cycle. Although the three stages of the cycle apply to all addictive substances, differences in their pharmacokinetics cause them to affect the brain and behavior in different ways. These differences explain why there are also differences in the pattern of use among different substances. For example, nicotine has a much shorter half-life than THC, the primary psychoactive substance in marijuana. So the effect of marijuana lasts longer and the withdrawal states occurs later. As a result, marijuana smokers do not typically smoke as frequently as tobacco smokers. Although there are differences in pharmacokinetics, when used over the long term, all substances of abuse cause dysfunction of the brain's dopamine reward system. Evidence? Imaging studies show a decrease in the dopamine receptor known as D2. So what's the implication of this finding? It suggests that in the addicted individual, the explosion of dopamine no longer provides the same effect as it did before. There is still an explosion of dopamine, but there are fewer receptors. Therefore, there's less pleasure, there is less reward. The reward system of the brain develops a decreased sensitivity to the substance. This may explain why, in many addicted persons, there's a compulsive increase in the amount of substance used. It's because the person tries to regain the pleasurable feelings the reward system once provided. So the person takes in more and more and more of the substance in an attempt to recapture the same amount of pleasure that he experienced before. In addition, the decrease in dopamine receptors also leads to a decreased pleasure related to other activities. This may explain why persons with substance use disorders do not get the same pleasure from once pleasurable activities such as eating, sex, and leisure activities. Another very important characteristic of substance use disorder is that the change in brain circuits may persist after the person has stopped taking the substance and even beyond detoxification. The effects of these brain changes may be shown by the repeated relapses and intense drug craving when the individual is exposed to substance-related stimuli. So there are persons who seem to have defeated the habit, but after several years, they go into relapse and finally take up the habit all over again.